So welcome all. I'm Don Berg. I am the Executive Director of Deeper Learning Advocates and the founder of Attitutor, which is my kind of media company, and I'll do consulting with that as well. The site that Attitutor and Deeper Learning Advocates have together is called holisticequity.org. And my background is that I homeschooled other people's kids for about 5 years back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And didn't find a sustainable business model, so started and crashed the business multiple times. And so that was kind of I intuitively figured out that self-directed learning was a good idea. And so what I was doing was a consensus-run small group using the community as the primary learning resource. And so having figured that out, it was years later, I think it was about 2008, that I discovered the International Democratic Education Conference and went and discovered that there's an entire world full of people who think like I do about education. And since I hadn't worked out a sustainable business model, I went and got a degree in psychology and then wrote a book that came out in 2022 that won some awards on creating holistic equity, schooling for holistic equity, that's the title. And then as soon as that book was put to bed, I started having fresh ideas, and so I have a new book out called the Agentic Schools Manifesto. I'm going to keep the presentation pretty short if I can, and then we will open it up to discussion. So I'm going to set some context, and then we're going to go into the handout, and that's the prompt for discussion is the handout, but I want to set the context for that discussion. So some of you may be familiar with the recent bestseller, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. This is a graph from his newsletter, After Babel, in which he's showing it's a piece of evidence to show that the rise in school alienation since 2012 is caused by social media or cell phones. Because he's focused, when his focused recommendation in schools is to regulate cell phones. So, if you can ban cell phones, we're going to take care of that rise since 2012. So interesting idea. And if you look at that, you would be remiss, would not be remiss for thinking that if you were to eliminate that part of the rise, you would have a substantial effect. You'd wipe out roughly half of the alienation if you were just looking at the proportions on that graph. But we'll come back to that later. So the anxious generation, he has 3 recommendations in it. One is to ban cell phones in K-12 schools. One is to set the social media age limit at 14 or something. To basically lower access, make sure that access to social media requires the involvement of parents and ideally banned under a certain age. And then the third one is to encourage a play-based childhood. And he encourages the play-based childhood. He's co-founder of an organization called Let Grow, which is a lot about enabling parents to enable more play-based, more freedom for kids, more autonomy for kids, doing stuff that in a generation where the parents have learned that the world is dangerous and you should protect your children, bubble wrap your children, that's not a good idea. And so but he does not suggest play-based schooling. And so it's an interesting difference in how he recommends what schools should be doing and what parents should be doing. And we'll come back to that. All right. So one of the things I want to emphasize here is that the necessity of precision in how we're pursuing education. So what happens in vagueness stays in vagueness. Now, one of the things is I know we're quite an international audience, so some of you may not get the reference there. So in an unusual move, I'm going to explain the gag. So visually, you can see that this is based on that sign. That's an actual sign in Las Vegas, Nevada. And in 2003, they had a campaign to promote Las Vegas called "What Happens if Vegas Stays in Vegas." So Vegas is, so that is the combination of those two things. But more importantly, Vegas is the perfect representation of vagueness, of not having enough knowledge to make an accurate prediction. So gambling is what Vegas is known for, and that is based on imprecise knowledge. And what you're doing in Vegas when you go to a casino, actually any casino in the world, is you're playing the odds against the house. So the reason that a gambling house can, a casino can set up these games is because they know that the odds are in their favor. They know that they will pay out some of the time, but they know that on the whole, the odds are in their favor, and so they're ultimately going to make money. Education should not be run by casinos. Education should not be the kind of gamble that happens in a casino, and that is currently what we have. In my book, Schooling for Holistic Equity, I go through a variety of data showing that roughly 50 to 70% of kids will be adversely affected in their educative process by disengagement. Disengagement will affect 50 to 70% of kids, and that's the odds that the house gives us. So disengagement, also what Jonathan Haidt's newsletter graph was showing the level of disengagement is there's a baseline rate. There's a certain amount of disengagement in the system that what he's claiming is that the effect of social media and cell phones, it goes up from a baseline rate, okay? That baseline rate is something that is affecting ultimately 50 to 70%. It may not affect 50% this year, but over time it's going to affect a lot of kids. Okay, and so that's the house we're gambling against. They didn't intend to set that up that way, but that's the way it's currently existing. So we're going to talk a little bit briefly to get about a better, stronger handle on this idea of precision. If what happens in vagueness stays in vagueness, we need to talk about how to be more precise. So we're going to talk about the language that we use. Discourses is the kind of general term. So some are more precise, some are less precise, and we can, persuasion is part of that thing, is that more vague language is more persuasive. So we need to keep that in mind. So we're going to talk about three different kinds of discourse. Marketing. So at the bottom, you see a little, visiting grandma across the river shouldn't be a drowning risk. So if I'm trying to visit grandma across the river, I should be able to get there without my life being on the line. Okay. So normally you have, you build a bridge for that. Well, we have a budget. In fact, in my area, we actually have some bridges that are old and not doing too great. So they need to be replaced. And so we have a fixed budget for this. And we've had some controversies around that. And then you could have a technical. So the policy discourse is a little different than the market. No one buys something because they, well, not entirely, but there's something going on. There's something in a moral sense, and this is making a moral argument. Like, hey, dying to visit grandma shouldn't literally be true. And then you have a different discourse. You have a different way of talking about things when you're talking about the policies that will create that bridge. But then you have to have a different conversation about what to make that bridge of, what design it should have, what criteria it should meet. Okay, so three different kinds of discourse. And the thing is that they're in these different arenas where different kinds of, vagueness and precision are at odds. Is the technical people have a conversation that the people who are paying for it may not even understand. But if you do not have an appropriately reality-based technical discourse, to use the example, we might build a bridge that is not going to serve the purpose. It is, might be fragile. It might be vulnerable to you build a wooden bridge and it gets termites and it gets eaten down or something. Something bad could happen if you're not sophisticated about the technical stuff. But that's where policy comes in. Policy is this blend of marketing discourse and technical discourse to create guidance so that the technical people don't spend everything we have on one thing instead of spreading it across all the needs that we have. But we also have to serve the purposes that were generated by persuasive language that was not precise. But we have to blend those in policy so that we get an outcome that is worth the risks that we take. And everything's always a risk, so it's never not risk. It's just a matter of which risks do you take. Okay. The back to basics, we're shifting gears. In the setting of context, we haven't actually shifted the point, but I want to harken back to an American phenomena called back to basics, which I'm calling here back to basics 1.0, because we're going to talk about back to basics 2.0 in the third part of this presentation. So back to basics was a conservative education movement, meaning it was about teacher-centric, delivering content, in fact, exclusive focus on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. It arose in the 60s and 70s, and actually it was very powerful. The original free school movement was one of the things that Back to Basics was reacting against, is that they were giving kids too much freedom. It needs to be teacher-centric, not student-centric. And literally there are education conservatives who have recently stated this is exactly what they believe. I have reactions to them on my website. Okay, another one is that strict obedience to authority, or the adult control, teacher-centric. And then the third one is no nonsense in schools. No social service, no art, no whatever. Now, basics is good political language because it makes complete sense. It's intuitively obvious, yes, you should have the basics. The question is, what basics are you going to talk about? They propose these, and I know Richard and a variety of the people, Shifan I know is on this, we have a different idea of what is basic, and it ain't those things. In fact, rights respecting education is an idea that says, particularly number 2, might not be the best way to approach this. We need to respect their rights, and that may not entail strict obedience. It may be another different kind of obedience. Or it might, what the free school rhetoric in the 70s, 60s and 70s was that authority should actually be not a factor, but that didn't play very well. Okay. So remember, anxious generation, ban the cell phones. That is an example of what counts as nonsense in schools. He's saying phones are nonsense. Get them out of the schools. Doesn't help. Okay, but that is fundamentally a back to basics attitude. So he's right in line. The reason, and he confidently predicted this morning on, I forgot what, I think it was on LinkedIn, he posted a thing saying he is confident that most schools will ban cell phones by the end of this year. And he's probably right. And it's because of this. It is because of, it is a form of intuitive back to basics 1.0 political rhetoric. Okay, but let's remember, what happens in vagueness stays in vagueness. So back to basics 1.0 is the mainstream paradigm that schools operate in. It is exactly what has already been done. It is very persuasive, but it is not precise. There is a misguided technical discourse. You'll hear things like science of reading or science of learning. And those are the recommendations they mostly make are basics 1.0, teacher control, tell the kids what to do, focus on the 3 R's. Okay, let's think about the alternative, my proposed alternative. And this is where paradigm, you remember it was the whole paradigm thing. I had that P alliteration in my title for this. There is a paradigm underneath this. And back to basics 1.0 is just the reinforcement of that mainstream paradigm. It's the same thing it's always been, just more of it. And banning cell phones fits into that. Okay. When we talk about back to basics 2.0, that's my political policy language. That's what I want to create a campaign around. But there's a technical discourse underneath that. And that is the catalytic pedagogy paradigm. That's the paradigm that we're talking about here, precisely prepared to promote promising pedagogies. So this is where we go to the handout. If you have it up, that's great. Basically, what you're going to see in the handout, and this is a QR code if you need to get to the thing. There's also, I said, a link in the chat. Okay, so there's three main principles. Now you notice that I think there's a bunch of different smaller statements that elaborate on those. It's 1, 2, and 3. But number 1 is learning is facilitated by well-being. Now that should not be controversial. However, I recently had someone say that they have doubts about that. He wasn't willing to elaborate at that moment, but it's interesting someone would actually, yeah, okay, we have to have that conversation. That's why there's so many points underneath that one in the handout, is we need to be able to be precise about what we mean by that. Second is educating children is about agency. This is the paradigm shift. This is because in the handout you'll see it is education is about agency, not delivering information, knowledge, skills, as appears to be assumed in the mainstream. Is content is not what education is about. That's the mainstream dominant paradigm, is that if it's all about the 3 R's and or delivering content within those 3 R's. I'm saying, nope, it is something fundamentally different, and you will organize things differently. So I had to write 2 books about it. And it is about agency. In schooling for holistic equity, I got the practices behind Back to Basics 2.0, and in the manifesto, Agentic Schools Manifesto, I elaborated the principles underlying it, and that's where I landed solidly on the idea of agency. And finally, schools must nurture their students. In countries that have common law traditions, which come out of England, and so all the former colonies, and others as well, but all the former colonies have some tradition of the common law being a basis for how you do things. And there's a guy named Blackstone who did some commentaries anyway. He talked about in loco parentis is what schools are fundamentally charged with, is they have to be the parent in the absence of the actual parent. And so nurturing children is something that parents are fundamentally responsible for, and that responsibility transfers to any educator. It could be, the tutor, whoever is. Once you're in charge of a child, then you must nurture your students according to the principle of in loco parentis. One of the things about that responsibility now is that we have more information than we did before. There are factors, particularly in psychology, that were not known to be causes of well-being in human beings, let alone children, and that's now the case. So that's why there's, I have to actually elaborate that point, is because we have new information and we need to update. And the way that schools organized under Back to Basics 1.0 happen is in contradiction to some of that. Thus, the necessity of talking about agency as what children's education is fundamentally about. Okay, so go to item 1.3b in particular. Actually, should get it out myself. 1.3b. Now, the last 2 words in that one are the focus right now, and that is causes disengagement. We know what causes disengagement. It is not a mystery. It is not not an unknown thing. So because we have scientific knowledge understanding that thing, that's why this is a technical conversation. Not everyone understands this. But if we're going to deal with disengagement, or alternatively called alienation in Haidt's graph, we need, when we have a causal model, we need to ask, well, let's think about that problem again. Let's revisit that. Okay, we got school alienation. Is that the proportion? Is that, if we deal with social media and ban cell phones, are we going to deal with almost half, or maybe a little slightly more than half of the problem? Well, no. This is what I did was, you'll notice the vertical axis is a little different. This is the actual proportion that they would handle. It is less, about 1/4 or 1/5, something like that. it is the baseline neglect is a typical thing, and the way he had presented that graph emphasized the change. It did not emphasize the baseline that it is arise from. So just dealing with, even if Haidt is right about all his claims about it, and that banning the cell phones from schools is going to have an effect, that's all the effect we can expect is that rise bit. We're not talking about the baseline. So this is the question. Do you want to treat the symptom, or do you want to treat the disease? And that's where we have to do things differently if we're going to treat the disease. But we have a scientific model to do that. And what I've proposed in my 2 books is that we have both the principles of Back to Basics 2.0, learning and facilitator well-being. It's about agency. We have to nurture the students, and where nurturing means we're supporting their primary psychological needs. We're supporting them in their autonomy, their competence, and their relatedness. But in order to do that, the practices have to be fundamentally different too. Right now, academics comes before everything else. In order to not disrupt the academics, when a conflict arises in a classroom, one of the typical strategies is send them out of the classroom, send them to the principal. If you can't handle it immediately, well, don't interfere with those academics. Don't stop the class and make sure that we have good relationships. No, forget the relationship, send them to the principal, let him deal with it. Okay? That's not okay. Not if education is about agency. If agency is what it's about, then we need to talk about governance. We need to be dealing with that conflict in that moment and resolving it, not just putting a patch over and trying to move on. You have to manage for engagement. You have to actually find out, are the kids engaged? Engagement's a technical discourse. It's not just, do they have their eyes on me? Some of you may be familiar with the no excuses schools, where they have this whole saying about having their eyes on me and listening to the speaker by having eye contact. Well, that's a behavior. That doesn't mean that they're emotionally, cognitively, agentically engaged with that. And then, of course, if you're going to improve citizenship, which if it's all about academics, that's a sideline. They'll talk about citizenship as a nice to have, but it's not going to be central. They improve citizenship by punishing, or they have Joyce found her way on. Good job, Joyce. And so improving citizenship needs to be about needs support, not managing them out of the room or whatever. It needs to be about their actual human needs. Okay, so since Richard is here and we have this event is part of both the rights-centric conversation, I wanted to be clear about where the UNCRC, which is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was became active in 1990. It was formulated in 1989. Enough countries did it, and now us in the United States are the only country in the world who have not signed on to this, which is an absurdity in its way, but there's a history there. But let's be clear that the CRC is a policy discourse, and it would like to have technical details involved, but at the time we didn't have the insights into primary human needs that we do now, and so it could not have the kind of grounded technical discourse we have now. And so what I propose is that Back to Basics 2.0 and catalytic pedagogy in particular are the technical discourse that can inform how UNCRC can be viewed as an educative or education policy framework. Okay, and there's a lot that goes into the CRC. This is a graphic from Wikipedia that kind of enumerates in very brief form, icon form, literally. There's 54 different aspects to the convention, so it's quite substantial. Okay. This is different ways to connect with me, but you can see I'm on Blue Sky and LinkedIn. I'm actually on Facebook too, but I have decided to minimize Facebook. I'm not off yet, but I am going to eventually migrate off that platform. So I emphasize LinkedIn and Blue Sky right now. I'm reachable through my website very easily. That wraps up my presentation.